So when we're dealing with the state systems, at least, we don't really deal with the federal systems. But when we're dealing with the state systems, and when we talk to regular people in like Shasta County where we live and stuff like that, that's one of their arguments. As soon as we say, oh, there needs to be some control on the amount of clear cutting, they say, oh, it's private property. They have the right to do whatever they like. So can you address that? Is that specific enough?
I think one of the biggest lies of this culture is the primacy of private property rights. And one of the reasons I think that is because private property rights shouldn't be called private property rights. What they should be called is... Well, let's back up for a second and talk about where the word private property comes from. Private property comes from the root depravare, which means deprive, because the rich Romans would wall off gardens to deprive the poor of their use. So really what private property, where it comes from in that notion, is with the enclosure of the commons. And this takes me down a little sideline that one of the famous writers from the middle of the 20th century, whom I really couldn't stand, was Garrett Hardin. And he was a private property booster and talked about how, it's also a eugenicist, but we'll leave that aside. He talked about how he wrote this famous essay called The Tragedy of the Commons. And in this, he talked about if you have a commons is what is... Oh, just a second. I'll back up a second. What's it called? Public trust. Mm-hmm. Basically, he wrote an essay called The Tragedy of the Commons, which was propaganda for private property. And in this essay, he talked about how if you have a commons, which I guess we would also call sort of a public trust, where you have, I hate to say that an area, a forest, a river, water, air belongs to everyone, because it doesn't belong to anyone. It is its own self. But we'll go with that for a second. There's this essay that Garrett Hardin wrote called The Tragedy of the Commons, which was a very famous essay and was a bit of propaganda for private property. And in this, he argued that if you have a commons where, for example, everyone could run sheep, it would be in everyone's best interest, in each person's individual best interest, to run more sheep than you're allowed. So if you have a commons in a village where they can run 40 sheep and there's 10 families, each one could run 4 sheep, excuse me, each one could run 4 sheep, then somebody's going to sneak an extra sheep on until that person has 5 sheep, somebody else has 6 sheep, and pretty soon the commons are trashed. Well, that's actually not how commons works. It should have been called the tragedy, the failure of the commons. Because how real commons works is that everyone understands that it is in the community's best interests to maintain the commons, which if you can run 40 sheep on it, and somebody starts running 6 sheep, then each person gets to run 4 sheep, then one person starts running 6 or 7 or 8, what happens is all the members of the community pay that person a visit, and they say, you can't do that. And if it happens again, they burn down his house. And this is how the Tolowa lived here for 12,500 years without destroying the places. They recognized that the salmon don't just belong to them. They're not something they grab. Instead, the salmon belong to the bears, it used to be in this area that you would see a grizzly bear every 15 minutes. Mm. And, of course, the last grizzly bear was killed in California, 100 years ago? Yeah. And the salmon belong to the salmon, and they belong to the river, and they belong to the eagles, and they belong to everyone else. And so no one would take more than, and if they did, like among the Lakota, for example, if someone took a bison out of season, they would be reduced to beggary. They would break all their weapons. They would burn their teepee. So the point is that private property, first off, comes from this notion of depriving everyone else. And second, in this culture, you don't really have... Private property doesn't really mean private property. What it means is you have the rights to destroy it, but you don't effectively have the rights to protect it. Because, for example, in Kansas, it's against the law to not kill prairie dogs. So someone can have 640 acres and say, I would like to protect the prairie dogs here, and you're not allowed. And they will forcefully come in and poison them. Or fracking is a great example. I live here, I'm really happy, and I like drinking water, and then somebody else has the right to poison my water supply. And so it's not actually even private property rights in the first place. And then there's the whole question of, it's really fun to laugh at, so-called banana republics and how the rich people own all the land there. Well, I got bad news, which is land ownership in the United States is more concentrated than it is in most Central American, South American countries. So when they talk about private property rights, it's a Trojan horse, really, because it's not really, Josephine Smith, who lives on her 4 acres, and she's being disallowed by, the stupid regulations from putting in a shed. That's just a Trojan horse. What they're really talking about is Sierra Pacific clear-cutting thousands of acres. And there's a big difference between those two. And really, it's like years ago, I was talking to my friend Jeanette Armstrong, and she was complaining about Forest Service restrictions on people, for example, gathering firewood or something. I said, hey, that's not really fair, because what about the forest, wanting to survive on its own? Why should everybody be allowed to go in and take firewood? And she said, the corporations get to go in and cut it all down anyway. So it's a 2-tier system. And if you're going to have a 2-tier system, it should be you actually should have a 2-tier system where individuals can live on their land and not use it for commerce. There should be a 2-tier where you have one level of protection for land where you can do things that are just simply about living, and a whole different level which is much more stringent that has to do with commerce. Or here's another great example of private property rights is everybody knows what happens when Walmart moves into a town, and the town is not allowed to stop Walmart from coming in because of Walmart's private property rights when they bought this land. But what about, there's a great example here in this town, there's a computer store. He's a really nice guy. My computer crapped out just a couple days ago. I took my computer in and he fixed it for me, and I said, how much is it going to cost? And he just looked at me like I was strange and said, it took me 5 minutes to fix your computer. Don't worry about it. And this happens all the time. He's a good guy. But he has to work at the prison because he can't buy computers for the same price that Walmart sells them. So his business has been destroyed by Walmart. One of the local grocery stores has gone out of business because of Walmart. This is just absolutely typical. And then there's this, do you know Thomas Lindsay? Mm-hmm. Okay, there's this guy, Thomas Lindsay, who does fabulous work. I love Thomas Lindsay. He's one of my heroes. And he does, I'm sure you've heard, okay, one of the things Thomas Lindsay does is there are a lot of communities around the country that have banned fracking in their township or in their city. Pittsburgh banned fracking within the city limits of Pittsburgh. There are a lot of communities that have banned corporate hog farms, Walmart. He's the one who writes a lot of those ordinances. Is it Ecuador that has rights of nature enshrined in its constitution? Mm-hmm. He wrote that.
Wow.
He's fabulous. And I asked him one time, so what happens is these communities come to him and they say, so we want to disallow fracking in our community, and then he helps them write an ordinance. And I said, it is against the U.S. Constitution to have community control over fracking because there's a commerce clause in the Constitution that disallows communities from determining all commercial regulation is ultimately dependent upon the federal government, state and federal governments. That's in the Constitution. And so when these people, why are you wasting your time? Because all of these ordinances that you're putting out there are going to get overturned at the state and federal level. So why are you wasting your time? And he looked at me and he said, when people come to me, they still believe we live in a democracy. And they still believe that a community should be able to control whether its water is polluted and whether its local community, its local economy is based on big box stores or local stores. They believe that they have the right to do that. And then they do it, and then they get completely screwed by the federal government. And he said, you want to make revolutionary cadres really quickly? What you do is take people who believe we live in a democracy and let the state show them that we don't.
Yeah.
So it's not actually private property rights. That's what they call it. It's really commercial rights. That's what it should, if they were telling the truth at all, that's what it should be called.
Yeah, that's really good. So when you look at the culture, and here we have this Western culture that sees ourselves as superior to everything else, what's wrong with that?
Human supremacism is the biggest problem that we face, the biggest problem the world faces, because we're not facing it. It's wrong on so many levels, from it's simply factually wrong to it creates this strange notion, that this incredibly narcissistic notion that everything is there for you to use, and in fact everything is a thing and it's not other beings. And it creates this, and it's also wrong because it's killing the planet. And you know, all of the the next book I write, when I finish the one I'm working on now, is probably going to be a book on human supremacism. And basically all the definitions of human supremacy, all the definitions that make humans superior, that define humans, it's redundant, let me just back up. Every definition that humans use to declare humans superior is tautological. Basically it consists of a characteristic that humans have that others don't, which means that humans are superior. And then any evidence that shows that they're not actually superior in that way is just ignored. And a great example of that is, well, one of the reasons we know we're the smartest is because we have like great memories. It ends up chimpanzees have better memories than humans do. And it ends up actually squirrels have better memories than humans do. Another great one is it's brain size. You know, humans have these big brains that make us so we're actually superior because we can think. These things called whales, these things called elephants. Their brains are much bigger than ours. Well, no, it's not brain size. The important thing is brain size to body mass ratio. Well, that's not so good either, because we have about a 2% brain size to body mass ratio, and songbirds have about a 10%. And actually the biggest body mass to brain size to body mass ratio out there is the shrew. Oh, well then that doesn't count, does it? You know, it's always a moving target. And of course it's almost impossible to talk about human supremacism without pointing out that this culture has from the beginning declared itself to be superior to everyone else. And there's white supremacism, there's male supremacism. You know, the fucking Bible is just full of examples of why males are, I mean, for God's sake, and it's just so ridiculous. Males are superior to females because Eve accepted fruit from a serpent, and so ever since then, she's got like nice rationale if you can get people to believe it. And it's the same with everything else. It's a great line by this Portuguese explorer talking about why it was acceptable to enslave Africans. When they speak, they fart with their tongues in their mouths. And so because the Africans did not speak Portuguese, they didn't speak. It's the same with non-humans. I mean, it just cracks me up. You know, the dogs, my mom has dogs, and they know more English than my mom knows dog. And I always love the example of the chimpanzees that they teach American Sign Language. And then, you know, they teach them this, and then some people, they have these big arguments about, gosh, so is this really language, or are they just mimicking? It's first off, how do humans learn language? We learn it by mimicking. But second, I'm sorry, between the scientists and the chimpanzees, which of them are bilingual? You know, the chimpanzees are actually learning a human language. How much chimp do the scientists know? And besides which, if a bunch of chimps kidnap some scientists and put them in mobile homes and taught them, you know, how quickly would the scientists learn chimp language? It's nuts. It's this way all down the line. Prairie dogs have grammar. Chickens lie to each other. A rooster will say to a hen, hey, there's some nice food over here. And then she'll come over and instead he wants sex. You know, they do this all the time. So it's just plants. It's always been clear to me that plants are intelligent, and let's leave my beliefs aside for a second and just talk about the fact that the root tips of plants are very similar to neurons. And I mean there's some great work being done on plant intelligence, even from a scientific perspective, not from a woo-woo perspective. Pretty cool stuff. Or there's this slime mold. They've put slime mold in a maze, and it grows randomly until it finds a food source. You take off a little bit of the slime mold, you put it back in a maze, it grows directly to the food source. It remembers. And Paul Stamets does some amazing work with mushrooms, and he was the one who pointed out to me that really when you think about a forest, you shouldn't be thinking about trees, you should think about mushrooms, because there are mycelial networks that run all through the forest. And there's this extraordinary experiment they did where they took trees from inside a forest, like that one there or this one here, and the little trees should not, if you put them in a greenhouse, they don't get enough sunlight to actually live. So where are they getting the food? It ends up that the mycelial networks are taking food from the trees in the sunlight and taking it over and giving it to the others. They are, and I hate this word, but I'm going to use it anyway, they're managing the forest. But there's a difference because they're not managing it for production. They're managing it for longevity.
Life.
For life. And one of the ways I think about human supremacism is I think, how would we feel if aliens came down from outer space and they were systematically wiping us out? And as they were doing so, they were having all these conversations about how do humans actually feel pain, or do they simply emit high-pitched vocalizations when under physical stress? And do they actually form relationships? Oh my God, fish form complex relationships within their communities, and some scientists studying it even use the word Machiavellian to describe some of the things that some of the fish do to other fish. They have intrigues. For God's sake, I often think about this, that I am absolutely certain that songbirds spend much of their time gossiping. That's what they're doing. They're chattering, and they have friends. Prairie dogs have best friends. They live in this big village, and the prairie dog, if you watch them very carefully, they'll spend a lot of time with this neighbor. They never spend any time with this neighbor because you know what that neighbor's like. And I don't understand I don't understand how. So I was doing an interview last spring by the phone, or a telephone interview, and it was for Nature Online. I don't like that magazine at all. It shouldn't be called Nature, it should be called Science. It's very, very mechanistic science. And the guy who was interviewing me was insisting that non-humans, that I was being anthropomorphic. Isn't that a wonderful word? That I was being anthropomorphic when I was talking about non-humans having feelings. And as we were talking, I was looking out the window to where a mother bear was lying on her back in the sun, and her 2 cubs were playing on her belly. And this is literally just what I was watching as I said this. And I said to him, So you're telling me that this mother bear is not enjoying the sun and enjoying her children. And he said, no, she's just having instinctual responses. And so my point is that there's an entire series of religious and philosophical justifications for human supremacism, but I don't really care how much religion or philosophy you throw out there. It's still not true. It's justification is all it is. And, scientists can say, well, I cited scientists earlier for plant intelligence, but the truth is that although 99 scientists out of 100 would swear that evolution has no end, has no purpose, when you look at how they spend their time, what they're spending their time doing is figuring out how to convert the world into resources for humans to use. So actions speak louder than words, and what their work is doing for the most part, for 99 out of 100, is promoting human supremacism. And it's just absurd. Once again, if they were aliens from outer space who were changing the climate and who were vacuuming the oceans, we would recognize that this is completely insane. But because it comes from this culture into which we've been inculcated, then we suddenly get really stupid. And here, one of the things, too, is they say one of the signs of intelligence is the ability to recognize patterns. So I'm going to lay out a pattern. Let's see if we can recognize it in less than 6,000 years, which is when you think of Iraq, is the first thing you think of normally cedar forest so thick that sunlight never touches the ground. That's what it was prior to the beginnings of this culture. One of the first written myths of this culture was Gilgamesh deforesting the plains and hillsides of Iraq to make a great city. And the Arabian Peninsula was oak savanna, and the Near East was heavily forested. We've all heard of the cedars of Lebanon. They still have one on their flag. Greece was heavily forested. Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato, I believe, all wrote about how deforestation was harming water quality. And I have no doubt that the Greek Department of Forestry told them that they need to study this problem for a few more years to make sure there's really a correlation. North Africa was heavily forested. Those forests went down for the Egyptian and Phoenician navies. The UK was heavily forested. Can we see that pattern? It's only been 6,000 years. This culture eats natural communities. There's a great line by Tecumseh's brother Chicksika, who said the whole white race is a monster and what it eats is land. And
so why don't we get smarter? When we have all this history to learn from, this is something that always gets me, is we've got all this history, and it's happened before. It's not like this is something new. There's just a lot more of us than there used to be. But why don't we look around and say, whoa, we've done this before. Shouldn't we do something else now?
A few reasons. One is, there are a few reasons that we don't look around and say, gosh, this is really stupid. One of them is because we receive tangible benefits for doing so. We receive this entire way of life. This entire way of life is based on destroying the natural world. You can't have mining without mines, and you can't have mines without massive toxics, without toxifying the total environment. You can't have the commercial use of wood products without deforestation. You can't have hydroelectricity without dams. The scientists think they're so smart because they talk about cause and effect, but they don't seem to understand that you can't live on a planet and murder it too. And so one of the reasons is that we are extremely well rewarded for not paying attention, and we are not the ones who are suffering the primary loss. And most of us don't give a shit. Another part of the problem is that the problems we face are not fundamentally rational and are therefore not amenable to rational solution. They are this entire culture is suffering from narcissistic personality disorder and also is sociopathological. And you can't stop Ted Bundy by saying, that kind of hurts women what you do. I mean, it doesn't work to talk to a sociopath. I mean, it wouldn't stop for Hannibal Lecter in the fictional versions. And R.D. Laing, the author of Politics of Experience, described the 3 rules of a dysfunctional family, which are also 3 rules of a dysfunctional culture. And the 3 rules of a dysfunctional family are: Rule A is don't. And Rule A1 is never discuss the existence or non-existence of rule. Oops, got to back up, sorry. R.D. Laing described the 3 rules of a dysfunctional family, which are also 3 rules of a dysfunctional culture. And Rule A is don't. Rule A1 is Rule A does not exist. And Rule A2 is never discuss the existence or non-existence of Rules A, A1, or A2. So what this meant within my own family is that we could talk about anything we wanted except for the violence that we had to pretend wasn't happening. My father was extremely abusive. So we could talk about anything in the world except for the thing we had to all pretend wasn't happening. And we also couldn't talk about the fact that we couldn't talk about that. And we couldn't talk about the fact that we couldn't talk about the fact that we couldn't talk about that. On a larger scale, we can talk about anything we want except for the fact that corporations are killing the planet, except for the fact that non-humans are living sentient subjects, that rivers are alive. I had this discussion with this guy, with that guy from science. He was just going completely bonkers at the notion that rivers are actually living beings. And I said, well, first off, you do know that, because he said water just passes through it. And I said, water, passes through you too, right? And also, that most of the cells inside your body don't actually have your DNA. They actually belong to somebody else. They're, bacteria, whatever. They're somebody else. They're in there. And so you do recognize that you're actually a process, right? And, he could not compute. So back to R.D. Laing. What this means is that we can talk about anything except for the most important things. And this is how you maintain an abusive dynamic, is by not talking about the important things. And it goes even deeper than that, though. There's this guy in the 1960s, Lester Laborsky, who did this experiment where he attached electrodes to people's eyeballs, and they would track where they would look. And he would show them a photograph that contained something that they found morally objectionable or that threatened their worldview. And what he found is that the people's eyeballs would not even track to it once, which means they saw out of the corners of their eyes what they were not supposed to look at, and then they didn't look at it. And if you ask them later, did you see this thing in the picture, they would say, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And this we all do this on a daily basis. I don't know if I am the only person in the planet who has ever been in a really bad relationship, but the 3 of us who have can form a support group or something. And but when I was in this relationship, if any of my friends would try to point out the problems in the relationship, I would say, why are you trying to ruin my perfect relationship? And then once the thing is over, it's like, oh my God, how did I not see that? And so the thing is, we do this all the time on a personal level. And especially when we are rewarded for doing so, in the larger case, by having access to ice cream 24/7 and having access to space heaters and hot showers. And, one of the questions I ask all the time is, what do all of the so-called solutions presented to global warming have in common? And what they all have in common is they take industrial capitalism as a given. And the natural world is that which, never who, but that which must conform to industrial capitalism. And that is literally insane in terms of being out of touch with physical reality. And it's also, it will never work. If you ask any reasonably intelligent 7-year-old, how do you stop global warming caused in great measure by the burning of oil and gas? They will tell you stop burning oil and gas. If you ask any reasonably intelligent 33-year-old who works for a green high-tech consulting firm how to stop global warming caused in great measure by the burning of oil and gas, they will give you an answer that helps a green high-tech consulting firm. Okay, so there's a great line by R.D. Laing where he talks about the socialization of children, and he says basically that we must turn them into imbeciles like ourselves with high IQs if possible. And so how do we not see it? Social rewards. It's just the way. And here's another part of it, is that I was writing this book, The Culture of Make-Believe, and the book was supposed to be a 5-page introduction to an encyclopedia of hate groups, and I asked the question, what is a hate group? And the book just exploded, because the first thing I did was go to a KKK website, and the KKK website said explicitly, we are not a hate group, we're a love group because we love whites. And I realized something immediately, which is if you go... This either means that A, the KKK is not a hate group, or B, you can't trust rhetoric. Well, if you can't trust rhetoric, what do you trust? And things got really sticky then, because if you go just by the numbers, and the biggest racist segregationist organization in the country is the U.S. judicial and penal system, because it's achieved segregation of African American males on a scale the KKK could only dream of. So the book's just going crazy after that. And I think my favorite line from that whole book is, any hatred felt long enough no longer feels like hatred. It feels like economics, or philosophy, or religion, or just the way things are. And part of the problem, this is a whole other big thing, but part of the problem, well, we'll wait and we'll see if we have time to go there. So I'll just stop there.
Okay. So yeah, I guess, and you started to talk about that a little bit, but can you talk about the bodyguard of lies and how it's, I mean, that's essentially the idea of rhetoric too, but, you know, when you're told by the agencies or the government or whoever's in charge, you know, they're telling you one thing when you know that those words are not true, or they're conspicuously leaving out a little section that would give you a whole different idea. But I mean, it's a lot about naming things too, and I should have looked it up before I came, but, you know, in the Bodyguard of Lies, I can't remember what your exact references were now. But
well, there's a bazillion of them.
Yeah,
you can just make them
there's
up.
a lot, and they're all really good. So.
Well, there's a couple directions to go with this. One of them is that one of my favorite lines I ever wrote was that in order to maintain our way of living, we must tell lies to each other, and especially to ourselves. It's not necessary that the lies be particularly believable, but merely that they be erected as barriers to truth. And we see this all the time, where people will throw out completely absurd rationale, and it doesn't... That's one of the places I came to the understanding that the problems we face are not fundamentally rational, because rational discourse doesn't really happen. I shouldn't say that, I should say reasonable discourse doesn't really happen. Because rationality really comes from a notion of... To rationalize a process is to remove all extraneous movement. So McDonald's, for example, rationalizes the production of fast food by having one person flip hamburgers. They reduce all extraneous movement. That's called rationalizing a process. That's one version of rationalizing a process. Another version of rationalizing a process is what we see with the California Department of Forestry or anywhere else, where they will ignore everything that doesn't serve their ends of getting out the cut. And they will do so actively. And you know, the question I ask myself on some level, but then on another level I don't really care about, is do they actually believe their lies? Or are they actually so institutionalized that... See, here's the deal. Is that Robert J. Lifton had this great book called The Nazi Doctors, in which he asked, how is it that men who had taken... Actually, let's go a different direction. Robert J. Lifton had this great... One of the most important things I ever read was how Robert J. Lifton talks about before you can commit any mass atrocity, you have to convince yourself that what you're doing is not, in fact, an atrocity, but instead a benefit. So, for example, the Nazis weren't actually committing genocide and mass murder, they were purifying the Aryan race. And likewise, whites in North America have never been committing genocide, but instead they're manifesting their destiny. And captains of industry are not murdering the planet, but instead they're developing natural resources. And this is true on a personal level, too. I mean, I have never in my life been a jerk. Every time I have ever been a jerk, I've had it fully rationalized. And afterwards, oh my God, I was a jerk. But, you know, it is very rare that someone does something without having it rationalized. And so I think a lot of the people who work for CDF, they have themselves convinced that they are, well, maybe they're just doing their job, you know? Or here's another part, is that Robert J. Lifton also wrote this great book called The Nazi Doctors, in which he asked how it was that men who had taken the Hippocratic Oath could work in death camps. And what he found is a lot of the doctors actually did care very deeply for the health of the inmates. They would do everything they could to help the Jews. They would hide them from selection officers. They would give them an extra scrap of potato to eat. They would, you know, do all this stuff, except for the most important thing of all, which is that they wouldn't question the existence of the death camp itself. They wouldn't question working them to death, starving them to death, gassing them to death. They wouldn't question that. So if you get a job for CDF, or you get a job for Sierra Pacific, or you get a job for Fox News, or for MSNBC, or for the U.S. military, it doesn't matter. You get a job, if you accept you can be an environmentalist for that matter. And this is one of the problems with a lot of environmentalism, is that we don't question the existence of the death camp culture, a culture that is working the planet to death, that's gassing it to death, that is starving it to death. And so what we as environmentalists end up doing is protecting whatever scraps we can, doing the best we can without questioning the larger picture, which is precisely analogous to the doctors in the death camp. And we can say the same thing for employees of CDF or whatever, which is that many of them probably are purely accepting the mission of CDF, that the job is to get out the cut. And, well, let's back off and go for an employee of Sierra Pacific who believes the job is to get out the cut, and who believes that trees grow like weeds, and doesn't understand that after 3 rotations it's dead, and doesn't give a shit about salmon, and doesn't give a shit about anyone who's not a human, but they do give a shit about making enough money they can buy a new pickup next year. And so they have it fully rationalized that way. And then I don't know about CDF so much, but I knew enough Forest Service employees to know that a lot of them, I'm talking about the timber people, I'm not talking about the biologists who oftentimes have good hearts, but the people putting out the cut, a lot of times they perceive themselves as buffeted by 2 powerful groups, and they're doing the best they can to compromise. And it's, of course, nonsense when you have Weyerhaeuser versus 5 people in a local community, and they're considering those 2 somehow equal when Weyerhaeuser is a God knows how many billion-dollar corporation. But anyway, that's how they perceive themselves, as trying to be Solomon and cutting the baby in 2. So what was the question?
the bodyguard of lies. But I think you answered that.
Oh, there's something else I want to say about that, too.
Okay, cool.
Which is something we always need to remember when we think about federal agencies, is that there was a great note as soon as the Interstate Commerce Commission was set up, which was set up primarily because people were so outraged at the railroads. They were just such community-destroying corporations. And, you know, much like the mining industry or the banking industry or the timber industry or pretty much any industry you want to mention. But anyway, the ICC was set up for that. And one of the heads of a railroad corporation sent a note to his buddy who was a Secretary of Commerce or whatever, and said, "How dare you put this up? You're going to destroy us. This is horrible. How could you do this, my friend?" And the guy wrote back and said, basically, "You're worried about nothing. We set this up to provide the illusion of actually protecting people. And we're doing this because people were so angry that if we didn't do it, there was going to be revolution. So we're doing this. Don't worry, it'll be entirely captured." And that is the, quote, natural history, end quote, of regulatory agencies. Is oftentimes they can start off being okay, and it doesn't take very long for them to be entirely captured. And a lot of times they're captured through financial pressure from the government. You get funding if you do the right thing, and you don't get funding if you don't do the right thing. Right thing being in quotes. Or another way it happens is through the revolving door, where they move directly from industry to regulation. And a lot of times, as we know from happened with the mining leases, they're literally sleeping together. So it's, and another thing that bugs me, I remember reading this when I was first getting politicized back in the 80s, that I remember reading something about some press correspondent, some guy covering the White House, just mentioned in passing in some other interview that he'd been playing tennis with one of the aides to the president. And that was one of the moments when my whole understanding of the press as the guardian of the people fell apart. Like, you don't fucking play tennis with somebody you're going to attempt to, there's a great line by I think it was Hearst that says, a publisher should have no friends. And this is so incredibly untrue. I mean, it's so incredibly untrue in how it works. And I can also understand from the perspective of the, it's just so interesting. We are so exquisitely, the press especially, but we all are so exquisitely sensitive to what questions we should or shouldn't ask. And, the press will ask these really hard questions about something, but it's the Artie Lang rule, because they will avoid the really important ones. And what happens to anybody who does end up in a White House press conference, who does ask the unforgivable sort of questions? They never get invited back. And so that's one of the ways the system works. I did an interview with Robert McChesney years ago, who talks a lot about media monopoly and how terrible the media is. And he said that when people talk about censorship, it's not really sort of a, what they think of when they think of Pravda-style censorship, where, you say the wrong thing and you end up getting sent off to a gulag and Stalin kills you. Instead, what happens is, if you say the right things, you get promoted. And if you don't say the right things, you end up doing the garage sale beat. Years and years ago, one of my first interviews was Richard Manning, who was a really good journalist, which is not something I say very often. And he got fired from his environmental beat for caring too much about the environment. And he said to me, when people do this, when they have the business beat, it's called cultivating your sources. But if you actually... And he also said that every story in the newspaper has to have two sides, which is the industry side and the environmentalist side. And he said, what about the side of the forest? What about the side of the ferns? What about the side of the actual living planet? You can't talk about that. That's one of the ways, and this might be a throwaway line you can put in somewhere else or just ignore, but that's one of the things that I've realized a long time ago, is that science is a much better means of social control than religion ever was, because if you don't believe in Christianity, you're just consigned to a hell you don't believe in. But if you don't believe in science, then you must be really stupid. And that's a tremendous way to... God, we don't want to be emotional, right?
Yeah, God forbid.
Yeah, God forbid. And God forbid, well, or Richard Dawkins forbid.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think the only other thing then is the third rotation thing, or, just talk about how things wear out when you keep cutting stuff and expecting it to regrow,
One of the things that just kills me about any discussions we have about sustainability is this belief that you can continually take without giving anything back. And one of the best lines I ever read was by John Livingston, and he said, there is no surplus in nature. And we don't need to cite him. We can just think about it for a second. Everyone is someone else's food. And if you take the food from someone else, then that means that other can't eat the food. And all I'm saying is that there are consequences for every action. That's not really a hard concept to grasp. And if 90% of the large fish in the oceans are gone. And if you weighed the fish in the oceans as of, I think it was 1850, and you weighed them now, they would weigh 10% of what they weighed back then. And you can't continue to remove. I mean, let's just ignore all those lives and all those communities, and lives that are just as precious to them as your life is to you and mine is to me. And all those communities are just as vibrant as the communities in which you find yourself embedded, in which I find myself embedded. Let's just ignore all that. You can't take that much carbon out of a system. You can't take that much nitrogen out of a system. You can't take that much flesh out of a system. I use that word, the nasty word systems. But you can't take, I'm going to back up, like I don't like it. See, that's the thing. I try not to use it, but we fall into it.
Yeah, you're just so used to language.
What was the last thing I said before systems? It was you can't
take
it weighs 10%.
Yeah.
Okay, you can't take all of that food out of a community without harming the community. I mean, what would people do if the food that's going into New York City was reduced by 90%? People understand that people would starve. But when it comes to the oceans, they get really stupid. It's the same thing. Chris Mazur has written that there is no forest in the world that has survived more than 3 rotations of cutting. And you cannot take all of this flesh, all of this biomass, all of this habitat. You can't take all of this living material out without expecting it to have consequences. And I don't like the mechanistic metaphor, but Paul Ehrlich talked about flying along and you look out the window and you see all these rivets popping on the wing. You know, 1 rivet may pop and you can still fly. 10 rivets may pop and you can still fly. But I got to tell you, you see like half the rivets pop on the wing, I would start getting worried. And, you know, I sent this essay out just recently. This guy wrote me requesting an essay about sustainability. And in my first response to him, I pointed out that 99% of the native forests have been destroyed. 99% of the prairies have been destroyed. And that 90% of the large fish in the oceans were gone. And he wrote back and said, so when you write about this, do you think that that's actually killing the planet or just killing the planet as we know it? And first off, I don't really see that the distinction is particularly important. But second, if you don't think that getting rid of 99% of the native forests is actually killing the planet, it's like, give me a threshold, buddy. Is it 99.5%, 99.8%, 107%? You know, at what point are you going to recognize this ain't working? There's a couple, and we could do more questions if you want, but even if we don't, there's I want to go, you can put this back in somewhere else. I just remembered another, the bodyguard of lies stuff we were talking about on the way up. Mm-hmm. But there's a couple of lies I want to mention, just in case you can use them. One of the lies that's often told by the timber industry and its boosters is that there are more trees in the world, or in North America today, than there were 500 years ago.
I think they use 80 years ago, too.
Okay, I'll use that.
Yeah, they're really fond of using 80 years ago because it's an interesting thing, and you said that in your book, too, where it's kind of like there's a cut. Where,
and the pronghorn antelope are a great example. One of the lies they use all the time, and one of the ways they manipulate truth, which makes me think that they actually don't believe this stuff, but instead are consciously, intentionally manipulating, is that they will say that there are more trees now than there were 80 years ago, or even 500 years ago. They'll say that too. And there's 2 things about that. One is they will choose the frame. And when they say there are more trees now than there were in North America than there were 80 years ago, they're choosing a time at which, a great example of this is, I was giving a talk in Massachusetts one time, and a guy said, no, we're living sustainably now. You look around, you see a lot more trees outside right now than you would have seen 150 years ago. And I said, yeah, the reason you got more trees in Massachusetts is because you're getting all your corn from Iowa. It's because you're exporting the damage. You're getting your wood from South America, and you're getting your food from Pennsylvania and Iowa. So yeah, you can have your trees grow back up, but that doesn't, just the damage is still there. So one is they love to choose specific frames that allow them to pretend that the damage isn't really damage. A really good example of that is pronghorn antelope. You know, we always hear there were 60 million bison. I believe there was about 25 million pronghorn antelope too. And I believe their numbers were reduced to about 12,000 in about 80, 90 years ago. And their numbers have recovered to, I don't know, I'm going to make this number up, 200,000. So they like to say, wow, they've gone from 12,000 to 200,000. Look how great things are for the pronghorn antelope. Yeah, that's still 200,000 versus 26 million. That's still less than 1% of what they were. So I love doing that sort of framing. And the other thing is that when they say there are more trees today, they're including seedlings versus large trees. There aren't actually a lot of trees per acre right here. But the trees are huge and they're old, and I don't know if you know this, but there are communities at the tops of these trees of creatures who never come to the ground. There are salamanders who live up there their entire lives. There are rodents who live up there their entire lives. Another part of this is that, for example, Sierra Pacific says that their rotation is 60 years, which means the average age of the tree is 30 years. And a 30-year-old tree is a baby. Many species of tree don't even become sexually mature until they're hundreds of years old. And the age, it's like I said to Dick Manning, wouldn't it be great if we could just set some land aside that had been cut over, and we set it aside, and then 200 years later we got some old growth? He just looked at me like I was an idiot and said, you do realize that in 200 years you are not even 1/5 or 1/10 of the way through the carbon cycle, because you've not even had one tree grow up, die of old age, fall over, and then rot. So for a forest to become really old growth will take thousands of years. In human terms, forests are not a renewable resource. And actually the truth is that forests aren't resources at all, because resources don't actually exist. Because trees don't consider themselves a timbered resource, and fish don't consider themselves a fisheries resource. I mean, are you a resource? I remember I was teaching at Eastern Washington University, and one of my students said that her major was human resource management. And I thought, my God, I've fallen into Nazi Germany, you know? This is just insane. I am not actually a resource. I am a subjective being. And so are they. Another lie they often tell is they will say that they are doing so-called timber harvests. They're doing deforestation. See, timber harvest, we've got lots of language. Every point they're going to be manipulative. Timber harvest. I mean, you harvest corn. You know, you don't harvest wild beings. You kill them. And, you know, I don't have a problem with, it's a whole other question we'll leave off. So they'll oftentimes say that they're doing the deforestation in order to improve habitat for wildlife. And one of the classic examples that they do is they'll say they're improving the habitat for white-tailed deer. And this is actually true, because white-tailed deer like edges. They like the edge between a forest and an open area, a meadow, or a clear cut. And the problem is that white-tailed deer are really common and becoming more so. And it is insane to attempt to improve habitat for an extremely common creature at the expense of creatures who are rare. But of course it's done because it serves the purpose of extraction. And that's really what the bottom line is with all of this, is how much can they get. And what they want is every last stick. And when they want it is now. And one of the things that we, as those who care about the land, need to learn or remember is that they are absolutely insatiable. If we haven't learned with 99% of the native forests having been cut that they will not stop until they are stopped, then it's not merely their denial that we need to worry about, but our own too. I had to perceive myself as, if I had to perceive part of my role, it would be like I'd be a member of the USO who is going to entertain the troops. You know, it's like I want to do for other people what some people have done for me, which is I read when I was in my 20s, I'm in a library in Spokane, Washington, and the book The Natural Alien jumps off the shelf at me. And it was the first book I ever read that did not take a utilitarian worldview as a given. And there was this great little bit in there about how he said, what do you do if you are making an impassioned defense of some creature and the person you're saying it to says back to you, well, what good is it? And he said, really the only answer you can give is, well, what good are you? Not to insult them, but to show the absurdity of the question. And I read that book, and for the first time in my life, I thought, I am not insane. The culture is insane. And a huge weight went off my shoulders. And really, in many ways, that book allowed me to do everything I've done. And so my work really is to help people understand, help to give courage to people who are doing the work and who are incredibly despairing because we're fucked. Because we are completely fucked. And the world is fucked. And we need to recognize that we're completely fucked and then get up and dust off our hands and brush the dust off our legs and get back to work. Because if you're in love, you act to defend your beloved. And if your beloved is in danger and you don't act to defend your beloved, you are not in love. And a lot of people will find a lot of reasons to not act. And what they all boil down to ultimately is because they would lose access to ice cream 24/7. But they won't ever say that. But that's really what it comes down to. Or also, there is we are inculcated from birth to be subservient. And we are inculcated from birth to, I mentioned this before, but if space aliens came down from outer space and they were changing the climate and they were giving people cancer, and I ask people at my talks, how many of you have had someone you love die of cancer? 80%, 70% say yes. And cancer is, of course, caused by the toxification of the total environment. Oh, sorry, it's a cancer gene. It's caused in great measure by the toxification of the total environment. And so people's parents and children and lovers and siblings and friends are dying. And they still value this culture over the lives of those they love. And we are taught from infancy to value this culture, this way of life, more than life itself. And that training is hard to break. And that doesn't alter the fact that I have no patience for people who are not willing to defend victims of this culture. We all, that's not true. I have patience for people who are under 25, who, you're young and stupid and it takes a while to vomit up the effects of this inculcation. And so I have patience for young people, for 17-year-olds who say, I don't know what to do. You're 17, you're not supposed to know what to do. You're 23, you're not supposed to know what to do. But I don't have any patience for people who are over 30, who are still dilly-dallying. The world's on fire. And I was doing a talk one time in Portland, Oregon. Afterwards, this guy came up to me and said, you talk about fighting back, but I don't think it's time to fight back yet. I said, okay, I can accept that. So 90% of the large fish in the oceans are gone. You give me a threshold at which is okay to fight back. So 91%, 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 100. And then he said, I don't think it'll ever be appropriate to fight back. And I said, well, I got nothing to say to you then. You know, what's the point of us talking? There's plenty of other people who recognize how bad things are and are willing to do something. And, you know, I'm not a big fan of Christianity, but I think it was Paul or one of them said, you know, if you go to a town and try to preach and they don't listen, just wipe the dust from the town off your shoes and go on the next one. It's the same thing. So, you know, if the people aren't listening, find others and you'll find people. For God's sake, you can't miss it. And people who don't even know, people notice, some people notice that they're never having to clean their windshields anymore. Some people don't. Mm. But some people do. Some people notice that there aren't as many songbirds at their bird feeders. Mm. And, oh, you know, actually, having said all this, there is one approach that I take to people who are, everybody has an issue. And like when I talk to the guy at the computer store, I don't talk about salmon because he doesn't care. What I do is I talk about the effects of big corporations on small businesses. Everybody's got an issue. I was doing a talk one time at a university, and I hate it when teachers force their students to come. I don't mind when they give extra credit because then they still want to come. But if they force them to come, they don't care. They're texting the whole time. They don't care about anything. So I'm doing a talk one time about the murder of the planet. Everybody's texting. Nobody's paying attention. And so I just stopped because it's just, I'm wasting my time, wasting their time. And instead, I talked about the fact that it's really crazy to the vast majority of people. I used to have this habit of asking people if they like their jobs. About 90% say no. And what does it mean when the vast majority of people spend the vast majority of their waking hours doing things they don't want to do? And so we go to college, and we're all miserable in college. And then we get jobs we're all miserable at, and we're already at 23, we're waiting till the day we retire. They stop texting. And they're like, what did you say? And so I went off on the wage economy. Because the truth is, a friend of mine says a lot of environmentalists begin by wanting to protect a specific piece of ground and end up questioning the foundations of Western civilization. Because once you start asking, why are they destroying this land? Then you start asking, why do they destroy land at all? And then you go back and back and back to the roots. Like if you start asking, why do men rape women? You end up at the foundations of patriarchy. You know, you go back to the violation imperative that's at the core of patriarchy. And likewise, if you say, why is our wage economy? Once the questions start, they start spiderwebbing their way out. So what we can do with the people who don't care about forests is we can find something that they do care about and just drive a little wedge and then just sort of tap at it. Every time you see them, just tap at the wedge, eventually it'll crack open.
Mm. Yeah, unfortunately, we're running out of time for little wedges.
Oh, that's why I don't waste my time with them.
Yeah.
I mean, that's somebody else's job.
Yeah.
I completely agree. But there are people who enjoy. I mean, there's people who like teaching 7th graders, for God's sake. Yeah. You know, so it's the same sort of deal that. Yeah. That, you know, I really. That thing I was telling you about the 2 essays, and the one I really liked and the one I didn't. Mm-hmm. One of the things I didn't like, James Howard Kunstler, do you know his work at all? Mm-mm. He does a lot of anti-suburbia stuff and anti-car culture. Mm. Pretty interesting guy. Complete curmudgeon. I've actually seen him hang up on interviewers. It's just fabulous. I've never had the guts to do it. I've almost done it. But one of the things he said one time was, at a question somebody asked at one of his talks, it was just really stupid. I would never have the guts to do this. He said, that's a really stupid question, a really uninformed question, and you should not ask that. And the guy was really offended. And he said, look, would you walk into a graduate seminar on quantum physics and ask a question that a 10th grade physics class would, if you had a 10th grade physics class, you would have answered? So the point is, I'm talking at a graduate level, he's saying, and you need to have that background. And if you don't, just don't waste both of our times. And that's really harsh, but I do feel like my work is sort of graduate level in terms of, you know, honestly, if I would have read my work when I was 17, I would have hated it. And if I would have read it at 20, I would have been disturbed but not liked it. At 22, would have been like, wow, that's pretty interesting. 23, I would have been hungry for it. So, when I say this, I'm not really blaming people. It's just, a great example of this, which doesn't need to go on or whatever, it's just silly, is that I was raised a Seventh-day Adventist, so like rock and roll was not a part of my life. Except my older brother introduced me to semi-rock and roll in maybe 7th or 8th grade. And I listened to AM radio for a while. And I started getting sick of that. And then my brother introduced me to FM radio. I was like, oh, my God, this is something. And so, no, it wasn't oh, my God, because I was still 7th Adventist. Oh, my goodness. And
By golly.
yeah. And I remember one day, I'm listening, I'm liking the FM, it's pretty good. And then one day they played Jimi Hendrix's Foxy Lady. And it's like, I remember turning out because that's too much. That's just too much. It wasn't that it was evil rock and roll, but it was just, I was not ready for Jimi Hendrix in 8th grade. It was, give me another couple years and it was fine. But so I think it's the same sort of
Evolution.
Evolution.
Yeah.